Well, good morning, folks, and welcome to the Community Profile Program on this Wednesday, September the 18th. Milton Baker and Sandy Alexander in the studio. Sandy, our co-host of the program and executive producer. Good morning to you, Miss Sandy. How are you?
Good morning, Milton. I'm well, and you?
Doing just fine, just fine. It's a pleasure, as always, to have with us a special guest in the studio, and we have a good program for you today.
Yes, we do.
Something that a lot of folks out there may have never heard about or given much thought to. Why don't you please introduce our guest today?
Okay, it's my pleasure to have Keith Price with us today from Rutherford County, from the Lincoln Center located in Bostic.
Keith, good morning to you. It's good to see you again.
Thank you for a bright, sunny good morning and welcome here in Cherryville. I've been looking forward to this since you asked me to be here, and I look forward to a good dialogue with you folks because we've dealt with each other a little bit before, and it's been very, more than pleasant. It's been very mutually beneficial, I think.
You are wearing a very patriotic shirt today. For those looking on ktcbroadcasting.com on the internet, you can see Keith's attire today, and he's on his shirt among the patriotic emblems there is the Lincoln Memorial, and we're here to talk about Abraham Lincoln today. And Keith, why don't you tell everybody about the Lincoln Center in Bostic and exactly what it is the Lincoln Center in Bostic stands for.
Milton, thank you. Yes, this was a gift. This shirt was a gift, and I appreciate it because it does typify Lincoln in our memory of him, along with our rebirth of a nation that he represented. In Rutherford County, ever since 1860s, the war years, the story was brought that far forward from the time in the turn of the century in 1800s when Nancy Hanks came to the old Enlow home place there, which is on Puzzle Creek outside of Bostic, just a few miles. And there she had earlier lived as an adopted bondservant, but more treated like one of the family, one of the children of the Abraham Enlow family. And later he came back there to give birth to her firstborn, who was a young black-haired boy she named Abraham. Mm-hmm. That story has pervaded, thankfully, despite the fact that, of course, this was Confederate country, and people here did not ever want to do anything to memorialize Lincoln in any way, even later. But despite the purposeful destruction of any evidences of this, it has pervaded through not only through word of mouth down through families, churches, and communities, but thankfully it was also documented by research historians who came and interviewed people who lived in the time that Nancy Hanks gave birth to her baby here, and were able to give first-hand accounts of it to several historians who did books on it. And these are evidential of this from a first-hand basis. But it's something that was kind of, all of us, anyone born in that area and raised in that area had a version of it we heard about through families mostly. Mm-hmm. But they had various additions and deletions and things to the story, but it all came down to the same basic story. Regardless of who the father might have been, regardless of other things, Nancy Hanks was there on Puzzle Creek in the old Enlow place when she gave birth to the baby. So we heard about it, but gave it very little due process back then. It's like so many things, we're too close to it perhaps. Yeah. But it's something that over the years I had become friendly with Tom Melton, a local historian who was a school principal. He was a graduate engineer of state, and then he graduated with a master's degree in Appalachian and education. He was a school principal. He was an entrepreneur, had his own insurance business. But through all that, he and his brother accumulated and preserved all the lore in that area, much of it about Abraham Lincoln being born there. I was away. After my high school years, I left Rutherford County, only to come back in 40 years later, which I've certainly enjoyed. But in doing so, I renewed my friendship with Tom, and he asked me to start traveling with him to make these appearances and to help him to present the Lincoln story. And I did that for several years, as I also made friends with Dr. Aaron Hyatt, who was a great historian, research historian all his life of Lincoln's background, and did so much to bring the information we now have.
Mm-hmm.
So that went on for a number of years, and then I began to realize how tenuous a thread this whole thing was hanging on.
Yeah.
Tom was losing his health. His brother Frank had just gotten killed in a tractor accident.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Hyatt was, like all of us, getting older. And I said, if we don't do something more than just talk about it, we're going to lose every bit of this eventually. It'll wear itself out, I'm afraid. And so I put a little announcement in the paper. We had the little town hall over at Bostic, Friends of Abraham Lincoln birthplace, we called it, just to have a meeting. And lo and behold, we packed the house. The people were there hanging in the windows and sitting in the all over the place and standing in the doorways, and had Tom there, one of the last appearances he made.
Mm-hmm.
And we just made a stand right there that we're going to do all we could to see that this was brought to the proper attention that the
Mm-hmm.
nation needed to know about.
Mm-hmm.
And from that point on, we got incorporated. We took the name Bostic Lincoln Center because, indeed, we are the center of Bostic there. Our facility there is used by Bostic for other things. We conduct festivities and other things for the town and at the town. But also we are a harbinger of all the stories about Lincoln's birth being there, thus the Lincoln. So we don't try to want to conflict with anybody else, other names, and we've gone through all that, but we are the Bostic Lincoln Center.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing we did was to hold a forum at the Cool Springs building there in Forest City for the first time to get these research historians that were still living, the ones that were still writing and working, plus the copies of the works of others, and some, of all things, we tried to get we followed up on Dr. Aaron Hyatt's work that he had done to locate the descendants of many of the possibilities of who Abraham Lincoln's father was.
Yes.
And of all the ones we had there, or had that testimony from, and all of them expressing their willingness to and desire to have their DNA materials used to do a DNA match with the known Lincoln materials. Of all the important ones we had there, the most important of all was one that Dr. Hyatt had located in Harrisburg, Virginia, Ernest Lincoln III, the last living male Lincoln of the Tom Lincoln side of the family.
Mm-hmm.
He not only was interested in this and wanting to participate, he and his wife came down and spent 2 days with us, stayed there for the forum, and he expressed his interest to have his DNA materials used to do the Y chromosome matching to identify whether or not he was, Abraham Lincoln was actually a Lincoln or not.
Yeah.
Had I been a Lincoln, I think I'd have said, I'm just going to sit on the story the way it is. But he wanted to know the truth. He really was forthright about it.
Yeah.
I think that's the tone that our Lincoln Center has taken, and it continues throughout. We want to stay on the high road. We're not going to get argumentative about anything, but we are going to try to bring forth all this that has existed all this time, but has been subordinated either through purposeful or neglect or apathy or what all the reasons, but it's nonetheless traditional truths along with the academic works I mentioned.
You have written accounts of Nancy Hanks and the little baby. Some letters that were written during the Civil War to substantiate this. You have stories handed down from generations that she actually did have this child before she married Tom Lincoln. So basically, what may or may not, depending on how the research turns out, and if you can ever get some DNA, you're working on trying to get some Abraham Lincoln DNA. That's been a stonewall you've been up against for a while. But if indeed Abraham Lincoln was born, and say along Puzzle Creek, before she married Tom Lincoln, if Tom Lincoln was not the father, then Abraham Lincoln, first of all, he was older than they say he was, and he was born in North Carolina as opposed to Kentucky. There you have an entire state that is unwilling to cooperate with any of this efforts, right?
It's understandably so to a great degree. But surprisingly, we've had some forthright things to happen between the two states, although we've had no opportunity to really interact very much. A good example of that, though, is when we had our formal opening at the Bostic Lincoln Center there, we had a number of reporters from various media. We had a reporter from the Raleigh News Observer. He spent 2 days there kind of representing AP as well, and we had about a dozen others. We had a call from a young reporter in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. He couldn't come, but he wanted to do a phone interview, which I was glad to do. And of course, I figured it would wind up being written in whatever context he wanted to do it in. But I still will, let the chips fall where they will. But surprisingly, he did a wonderfully open report, put it on the front page of the Sunday paper in color. Okay. Headline was "War Between the States," but his context was strictly fair. He offered some of the key things that we have as evidence here, along with their version of it there in Kentucky, but it wasn't an argumentative thing at all. And I think that's the aspect and the context, and that's the way history evolves. All of it starts out just about in oral fashion, because who knows that this person being born here was going to be something great later. It has to evolve. History has always of all the sciences or arts, artful sciences, history is the most flexible of all, because we're continually learning matter that we didn't know before, and as the means to transmit it and share it, such as the computer age, history is becoming more factual and more fortified than ever, and it changes constantly. But we're not out to take any kind of aggressive approach toward any other aspect. We're just wanting the facts of what was done here and what has been so well documented and so well preserved. It should be given due process and due regard, and I think that we'll let it stand on its own.
Yeah, Sandy.
Well, I was telling Keith in the next room. I don't know if you remember or not. Last year, my daughter acted in the Rutherford County drama. They did the diary, or was it the diary of Nancy Hanks?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a story all about the little girl, Nancy, who lived with the Enlow family, and who later on went on to give birth to Abraham Lincoln. Written by a Shelby native, Ludi Wilkie, a playwright. And it was so interesting. I mean, just the events that happened. Then Tom later on married Nancy, went on to Kentucky. So, there's just so many questions and holes in there that you just maybe draw your own conclusion to. But what we would love to know is the actual facts.
Yes.
I think, and hearing you speak on this before at a meeting I attended a few weeks ago, it's very interesting the different types of people Enlow was. Mm-hmm. I can't think of his first name right now.
Abraham.
Abraham Enlow. Well, of course, Abraham Enlow. Abraham Enlow was and the difference between him and Tom Lincoln. Mm-hmm. Not saying that Tom Lincoln couldn't father a great man who was a president of the United States later on, but I heard the discussion about Tom Lincoln was paid to marry Nancy Hanks. He was given money, a wagon, and a horse, and that the baby was already born. Whether it was Abraham Enlow's baby or not, that's also somewhat up for discussion. There may have been another man involved, but why do you think Nancy Hanks chose the name Abraham if Abraham Enlow was not the father?
Well, I think that's one of the key elements. Is, of course, we're all going to have to you draw projections and you speak of things in the context of what you know. But to me, one of the key elements of this is, here's a young girl. She came down from Virginia with her mother Lucy and her sister Amanda. They came from the river country of Virginia. They lived with Uncle Dickie Hanks down here on a cabin he had on the South Fork of the Catawba. And there's a monument there that has been put up for ages there on the Stowe property. Mm-hmm. It's now been encompassed by the town of Belmont, but the monument is still there, well marked, where that cabin was located. They lived there with Uncle Dickie for quite a time, but he died. There's stories about whether the cabin burned, he died in the fire. Not sure. But whatever caused, Lucy was thrown out to fend for herself.
Hmm.
She was a spinster. And so she tried to come and live with people and spin for them, flax and wool and cotton and all the fibers they had. But there she had 2 extra mouths to feed, those 2 daughters. And I can imagine that was not a very likely thing, because folks had enough time keeping, bread on the table for their families. This was not a prosperous plantation society here, with a few exceptions up in the upper part of the Broad River. Most of it was hard-scramble farmers trying to eke out livings. And she may have found some work, but it wasn't enough to keep her going. So sooner than later, she had to bind these children out, which she did in Rutherford County. She was in the Rutherford County area. Of course, Rutherford County is a mother of 16 counties. So when you speak of Rutherford County, where you are depends on what time in history you are, because at one time it went to wherever, the Mississippi River, the Indian Territory, or whatever. And then eventually 16 other counties have been formed from what was Rutherford County then.
Mm-hmm.
But she was here in Rutherford County, somewhere in the area of Bostic. Bostic didn't even exist then. Rutherford was about the only little village around. Some crossroads that were like Burnt Chimney were to evolve later, which became Forest City. But she was in there somewhere and had to place these children with other families. Mm-hmm. Thankfully, Nancy was given to the Enlow family. They treated her like one of their own. They had 16 of their own children, but they treated her just like one another. Educated her, took her to church. She was a member of the church, of the Concord Church eventually. Mm-hmm. She was very popular. She was musical and a pretty girl. And all these things were part of her life. Now, regardless of how, later on, when the Enlow family moved west, they were entrepreneurs. He along with Colonel Felix Walker and a lot of others, they were always looking to grow. They conducted some of the first cattle drives in America. Mm-hmm. It wasn't out in Kansas City or Texas or anything. It was here. And they would drive cattle or livestock into the low country down around Charleston. Mm-hmm. That was about the only means these hardscrabble farmers had here to convert anything to cash. The rest of what they grew and all just about was to keep them alive, subsistent farming. Mm-hmm. So he was part of all that. He married an Edgerton when he came to Rutherford County, and the Edgerton family was landed and well endowed too. So they were always gathering up, and they always looking forward for opportunities. So he and a few others, the Nannies and Walkers and all, went to SoCo area, then later on into Oconaluftee. And at that point, Nancy, of course, had moved with them as one of the children. Mm-hmm. They acquired a nice tracts of land. They were considered neighbors, although they might have been 20, 30 miles apart. That was neighbors back then, and those times. They stayed in close touch with each other. But at some point in time, Nancy was no longer welcome in that house. Well, there are versions of that, and we're trying to preserve them all. There at the Bostic Lincoln Center, we're not giving preferential due process to anything, but everyone. There happens to be a greater amount of the Enlow evidences, but that doesn't give them priority. We try to give them all equal. But whatever the case was, Nancy wound up birthing a child, and she did it at the old Enlow place on Puzzle Creek. Mm-hmm. For whatever reasons, a lot of reasons. But would a young girl, her firstborn, wouldn't she choose the name for that male child to be the person she held in highest regard, this guardian father figure who was Abraham Enlow? Not necessarily he was a father. In fact, I don't think, not probably. I think that's kind of a side possibility.
He was someone that took her in and nurtured her and fed her. And
she would name the child after the man she held in highest regard, mm-hmm. regardless
so
of everything else.
Not necessarily the father.
I don't think the fatherhood, paternity, a part of it, would certainly play into it or could, and we can talk about that endlessly. But I think that the primary naming of the child, in any case, any child, any woman, any mother would name that child after. In the case of a male, some male that she had in her life that meant the most.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the facts are, Abraham Lincoln's mother was in the Rutherford County area. There's no disputing that. Mm-hmm. She had a child. Was that child Abraham Lincoln or not? That is the question right there. And then, of course, later on, trying to determine the father, that's another thing. But the fact that Tom Lincoln came along, tell us a little bit about Tom Lincoln and how he came into the picture and sort of took Nancy Hanks and the child in,
Right.
as they were sort of he was paid to do it, basically, to marry
Yes.
her and take over.
There's a considerable gifting there that was a part of all that. A wagon, a team, and a sum of money, approximately $500, as best can be determined. Where did all that come from, and how was that passed on by Abraham Enlow to Tom Lincoln? There's several possibilities, but regardless of whether it came from Enlow himself, he was certainly probably able to do that. But if you think about the fact that Nancy was banished from the home there, not necessarily because it was any suspect that Enlow was or was not the father of the child, but she was no longer welcome there. I don't think he could have taken that kind of a gift without incurring a whole lot of wrath from Mrs. Enlow. This money going to this girl. There might be a third party involved, and that's where the John C. Calhoun story plays in, and it does with a pretty good authenticity. But regardless, Tom left with Nancy and the baby and went west. There's a book now that's been published several years ago by Jean Tisdale, her Dacus Ancestors. He in the service of the Confederacy defending Richmond and so forth. She at home, the mother at home, and they wrote and kept their letters. In 1864, she wrote a letter to him saying that around here, aside from the talk of war, it's because it's that old Abe was from here, and Mrs. Martin knew Nancy and saw the baby sitting in her lap when the wagon train headed west. This was written in 1864. Later on, when all these people these research historians came back and talked with all these people who knew Nancy, who attested to these things, they had no reason to, there's no gain for them in doing so. They just testified what was true, and these research historians took the exceptional effort. It began with Lincoln's longtime law partner, William Herndon, Judge William Herndon. Lincoln called him Billy. They were partners there in that law office in Springfield for years. He was like a fly on the wall in that office. He heard all the people trying to push Lincoln and trying to say, where'd you come from, who your family, politics,
Mm-hmm.
We've got that going on today. Where were you born, and who was your mother, and who was your father?
Right.
Well, back then it would have been political suicide for Lincoln to even be thought of as having an illegitimacy, what they call it illegitimate, what we'd call a single parent birth now. It's not that big a deal. It's not demeaning. But at that time, that would have been political suicide. If indeed John C. Calhoun, young Calhoun, attorney seeking office, that would have been equally damning for him if that story came out. And that kind of brings about the story. There was a Hank's Tavern in a town in South Carolina near where Clemson is now, called Creightonville. It doesn't exist anymore, but the foundation is still there with a marker where the Hank's Tavern was located, and Nancy worked there at their relative's tavern for a time when John C. Calhoun was traveling the court circuit, a young attorney. He stayed there, ate there at the tavern, stayed there, whatever as the court moved, circuit court. So that's where the possibility of this story came about, and it's pretty well documented in the Clemson archives. Dr. Aaron Hyde has searched out all this, and he was a very resourceful historian as well as an academician. He had a career at Western Carolina. He wound up being the dean of graduate school and assistant to the chancellor. But he had this interest from a time when he was a young boy born there in Hazelwood about the birth of Lincoln there in Oconaluftee. If you want to see the old Enlow home place there, that is now called the Mountain Farm Museum. It's operated by the National Park Service. As you drop off the parkway going into Cherokee, it's a national site there. That is the old Abraham Enlow home place. That was the last place where Nancy lived with that family. The only original building that's still there is the barn. They've moved other log structures in there to replicate or kind of typify what it was like. But there again, once we were formed up as Bostic Lincoln Center, we're now a place to share this. We're getting information and contribution every day that we would never have gotten otherwise.
Yeah.
And one of them was a friend of mine from Caroline. He's he's retired in Raleigh after a career in government, and he's been very active in this Textile Crescent Reconstruction. He found a book and sent me a copy of it. The name of it is A Child That Toileth Not. A federal agent was in that area in the 1900s on a completely different mission, but he encountered this bottomland with a log two-story, what had been a home now being used as a barn. He took a picture of it and talked to the people and said, oh yeah, that was the old Inlow home place where Nancy Hanks was a bondservant with the family, the mother of Abraham Lincoln. He wrote about this in the 1900s. It's in it came from all these various directions. I wouldn't have had a clue that anything like that was written, much less a picture taken of it, unless my friend Leon Neal had sent it to me.
Well, now, there are descendants of Tom Lincoln, of Inlow. There are descendants of the Calhoun. And these people, if I understand correctly, are all willing to have DNA, testing done. The problem is getting DNA from the man of the hour, Abraham Lincoln.
Yes.
Tell us how that is a stumbling block of getting any Abraham Lincoln DNA.
Dr. Aaron Heights, to be thankful for all of this. Now he's not going to ever be able to write this book I hoped he would write. He has medical challenges now, and what a great loss this is. But during all his lifetime of looking into the origins of Lincoln, from the time he was at Western Carolina, he retired there and became president of Macon College. He continued that there, Clemson Archives, other places. Then after that, he retired and became general secretary of Rotary International in Illinois. And he was able to get all this unique insight from all these various areas. Plus, he always thought if he could get into the inner workings of the Smithsonian, that would really solidify a lot of this. He gained enough political clout and had some influential people with Rotary and other things that were able to finally get him past the front gate, so to speak, in the Smithsonian, to really find out what they had to authenticate Lincoln's birth. They started backing up, saying, well, wait a minute now, the DNA may be contaminated, the blood stains at the site, what we have we can't authenticate as being uncontaminated. Someone else might have had this hat on, and their hair's in the hat as well as Lincoln's, and so they kind of backed up, and he was really taken aback by that and downhearted, to say the least. But they did make him aware of the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Washington, which is part of the Department of Health, but it's a military operation. They do all the identification on our fallen dead from all over the world and all the various wars to bring them back and identify them, and they're the leading edge, the most recognized. They have in their possession authentic, uncontaminated DNA-bearing materials of Abraham Lincoln. I don't know that all these other stories about somebody bought some blood-stained stuff here, and somebody, a while back, I think it was Fox News, came up with this real breaking story about the Armed Force, the Grand Army of the Republic Museum in Philadelphia had some Lincoln blood-stained clothing from the death scene. You got to get with them. We said, let's hold off. We've come that far before, only to bump into the lack of ability to authenticate. Totally. I mean, procedurally, state of the art. And so we've kind of let them know we're here. We'll like to work with you in any way, but let's keep going where we are, because I think in the final analysis, this Armed Forces Institute is going to be the one, once done, that would be given the due regard without question around the world. So Dr. Hite not only found that, he located all these male Y chromosome bearing descendants of these, as many of these stories as he could, and there were a lot, but he was the one that located this Ernest Lincoln III. So it's kind of down to this. Please, the board of directors is not going to authorize it till politically we can get this strength to get it done. So we're going to keep trying to build popular support, political support. Events like this that you're giving, this opportunity you're giving us right now is very key to all of this, and much appreciated. I think this is the only way a lot of times the only thing going to happen is grassroots, and I think this is a classic case of it.
Well, you're getting your message out. You're in Rutherford County. Our signal reaches into Rutherford County, but you're getting your message out here on the radio stations to 16 or more counties and on the internet around the world.
This is unique.
And this is probably the first time a lot of folks out there have heard this. Granted, this is the South, Abraham Lincoln, maybe to a lot of folks, still not that popular in the South.
Very much so.
But what is to gain if you do prove once and for all definitively, hey, Abraham Lincoln was born in Rutherford County in a place called Puzzle Creek. It's not going to change who he was. It's not going to really change the history of what happened, but it's just there to be known.
Exactly. I think all of us who've picked up on this, all at every stage through all this, we at some point in time would say the same thing the skeptic would. So what? So what?
Yeah.
What difference does it make? Well, our point is this. First of all, this was a Wild West. Right through here was where the old wagon road came down from Pennsylvania. People were coming west, trying to find a way across the mountains to have a chance at something to call their own for the first time, to have something called freedom they really didn't understand, but they were willing to risk it all. Indians, malefactors, bad government, everything in the world. They wanted a chance to go across that mountain and have something. And they formed up here in this very area we're in now, this old later became the upper end of the old cotton belt. But this was a unique place. The bloodlines were making into what was the first common American. Mm-hmm. They didn't descend from any landed gentry that wound up with the big plantations or the big Boston manufacturing and banking and investments. This was a grassroots, hardscrabble American created here, and we are all what our genetics make us. Mm-hmm. You can cut it any way you want to. We're a product of our genetics, the family, first of all, of course, and the community from which they sprang. Mm-hmm. We are formed so much, and that Lincoln, to us, is the epitome of the first common American who did ascend to that dream all the way to being the president. Mm-hmm. We don't try to memorialize him. So many people, Tom Lincoln just loved Lincoln. Tom Melton just loved Lincoln. He was a disciple of Lincoln. Carl Sandburg wrote that 7-volume prose poem is what it is. He honored Lincoln. He immortalized him. Mm-hmm. He wasn't about what he came from. He was about what he became.
Yeah.
But to us, it would be one of the most healing things, the most meaningful things to this country, particularly in this very time when we're so torn apart again. Not a whole lot unlike the times that preceded the war between the states. We need to be brought together, and I don't know of a better thing right now to authenticate that Lincoln came from this Wild West, this melting pot of people trying to just eke out something and have something called their own and take all the chances to do it. Mm-hmm. I think it'd be one of the best things that could ever happen in this country.
Yeah. And that's good to know to end on. There's so many other factions of this story we could go into, and we've got to have you come back and touch on some other things. The resemblance to descendants, the fact that Abraham Lincoln did not have much to do with this Tom Lincoln, if I'm correct.
Never even went to his funeral.
Right. Yeah. So we've got to have you back to touch on that, because there's a lot more to this story than we can cover in the time we have here today. But Sandy, did you learn something new today?
I certainly did. Thank you, Mr. Price. I'm just blown away. Like I told you, the play where my daughter played Sarah Enlow left so many gaps in there. So thank you so much for coming.
And when you come back, and we hope you will, or if it doesn't suit, we can do it over the telephone. We'll talk about the Lincoln Center more in depth, what your hours and so forth there.
We're very proud.
Yeah.
We're very proud. Want people to come visit us.
Yeah. So we'll definitely have you back with us. We've just run past time here today, but it's such an interesting topic. And we'll talk about the news story that Doug Mays did on Channel 9 back a few years back before he retired, and all the other publicity that's been given this. So thank you, sir. Keith Price with us today. Sandy, that wraps it up for the community profile today and for this week. Now, next week, we've got a full slate of guests scheduled, I believe.
We're working on Monday. Jackie Sibley will be here on Tuesday. Doug Mays
will be our guest.
Will be our guest on Wednesday. Don't forget Mayberry Day starts on 26th if you're heading up to Mount Airy.
Yep.
And then on the 27th at 11 p.m.,
on Channel 3,
our
WDTV.
Mr. Doug will be doing the news.
He will be anchoring TV news be sitting in as the substitute anchor Friday night, 11 o'clock. Friday night, September 27th. He'll be back on television on Channel
Can't
3.
wait to see him.
91 years old. And
91.
be anchoring the news. So we're looking forward to that. Thank you, folks, for tuning in today. Again, many, many thanks to our guests today in this fascinating,
Absolutely.
very fascinating topic. We'll continue this discussion at a later time.
We will.
All
Thank
right.
you, everybody.
America.
It's a free country.
And we're proud to be in the land of free radio. Thanks for supporting our fee-free station.
Big O Country, WHS Shelby, WLON Lincoln, and WCSL, Cherryville, Gastonia. Here's what's up in Cleveland, Gaston, and Lincoln counties, brought to you by the WhatsApp Chopper.